Hey everyone, Danny Diaz here. I'm going to go over the animation breakdown for the VFX that Colton did in Unreal. So in that animation, we went ahead and used my facial rig here. So this facial rig is actually pretty interesting because I created it for it to be game ready, but as well as I gave it a lot of extra control. And the animation that I'm speaking of is based on this right here. It's a scene from The Mummy, and I'll play the scene here in just a sec. It's only a few seconds, but it goes from right about here.
Look at I got.
Now, this scene, as you can see, there are a lot of large poses that happen with the mouth there. So, getting that to happen to this degree was a bit tricky. So luckily, the way I made this rig, there's a lot of potential with the joints. So considering that a lot of the hierarchies are based under this joint here, and this guy simply driving the rest of it, I was able to, as you can see, the way that I parented stuff and I weighted the joints, I was also able to move the jaw. It actually worked quite well for a lot of the shots that I have here. So I'll go ahead and play back the animation there here in a second. Let's see what it is.
Look at I got.
So what's nice about this rig is that, again, a lot of the stuff is parented so cleanly and perfectly that I was able to move the jaw in very exaggerated ways that really helped in the long run, as you can see. This rig is actually quite robust, and in fact, I could still even push this further and drop it down. But this felt more appropriate. And what's nice about the way that this rig is built as well is the way that the inputs are layered. This control here for the mouth allows me to also go ahead and shrink and move and change the overall expression in real time as I'm animating. But yeah, the jaw was the most important part about getting this to work correctly. And overall, I had a lot of success. Now, the gap here was a bit tricky, but overall, the effect in Unreal would be that it would have a sand effect, much like the Mummy has right here, but in a more exaggerated way, that the entire mesh itself would be covered in that, which is why I didn't actually bother animating the eyes, but I did the eyebrows and the mouth, the larger parts of the head, as well as towards the end where you shake off like this. It worked pretty well. And to get this into Unreal, it was actually a very simple process. So I had to make sure that in the gums and the head model and the teeth, all of the layers here, the gums, it has those layers right there, as well as the head. And in this case, since he speaks in the beginning, I had to get the vowels and bake all of these respective vowels to get what I wanted out of it. And as well as the lower teeth that are under the jaw right there, had to make sure that I would also bake these out. And once everything was baked out, these are simple morph targets that could be easily malleable and tweaked inside of Unreal. And this is where Colton put on his VFX shader. And yeah, this is my overview on how I went ahead and did this animation for this project.
Okay, so the effect that I actually wanted to create is not necessarily the one from the movie. The animation's based on that scene in the movie, but the effect I wanted to do is what's actually seen on the Revenge of the Mummy ride at Universal Studios, where the face is made entirely of sand, and there's a bunch of sand falling off, and all kinds of stuff like that. So let's get started. All right, so I just got that cool animation from Danny Diaz, and now I'm just going to try and make it look super cool with some stuff in Houdini and Unreal. So first off is this cool smoke effect that I did in Houdini. And it started off pretty simple. I just dropped a sphere in the scene. You can kind of see the sphere down here. And then I went up to Pyro Effects up here and just clicked on Billowy Smoke. And what that did was it created, the pyro source, and it output it here to the Pyro import and the AutoDOP network. So anytime I'm dealing with like fire or smoke in Houdini, I always like to come into the AutoDOP network, and the first thing I look at is the Pyro node. And in here you can look at like the division size of the box that it's in. So I changed the division size and kind of shaped up the box and the size and everything to what I want. So I had this nice tower of smoke that kind of filled up all the way to the top, really, before it like cooled down all the way and disappeared, like dissipated. The next thing I look at is this resize container. I just changed the padding, so I got a little bit better simulation out of it, a little bit sharper imagery. Nothing too crazy there. The other thing that I always look at when I'm doing this is the pyro solver here, and this is where the important stuff is. So the first thing I look at is the simulation. For this one, I sped it up a little bit, so instead of just 1 in the time scale, I sped it up 1.5. Has temperature diffusion, which is basically just how quickly it dissipates over time, like in relation to the cooling rate. I kind of tweaked that, again, in relation to the cooling rate till I got something that I liked. This buoyancy lift also helps it really go up and fill up this this container. And then I just have the default direction there, so it's just going up. The combustion, I didn't really change anything in here, but you can always enable stuff and get some like some burn rate and some gas and some other interesting stuff. But for what I wanted, I think I just had to mess with the shape a little bit. So I turned on the dissipation, the disturbance, the shredding, the sharpening, and the turbulence. And then I just plugged in some values. This took just some experimentation. It just takes some time to kind of get used to what each of these things does. So you can turn one on, type in some numbers, render it out or simulate it out, and then turn on the next one, change some numbers, do the same thing. And I just kind of experimented until I got something that looked pretty cool in my opinion. And it should be all simulated out. So if I hit play here, you get something that looks kind of like this. Which is neat. And then obviously for this effect, I actually needed it to loop. So the way I loop it is we go into this pyro import, and this is what's actually being shown in the scene right now. So there's this neat little node that's from the game development tool set. That's called Make Loop. You can just click and drag that into the thing. And you can just tell it, your start frame. So I started somewhere in the middle of the simulation. I started at frame 100 because I wanted this to already start out having a whole bunch of smoke in here. And I just simmed out to 163. So I had, about 64 frames, I think is the math on that. Seems like a nice round number. And then what I did is I always add a distant light just so I get a little bit of shadowing and stuff. I get some color variation that looks decent. And then I just dropped in a camera. So if I go to my camera here, you can see the camera is actually recording from the very top of the simulation here. And so if I back this up, you can see kind of what it's looking like and what the looping is doing to it. So it just plays through and it loops the effect. And that's exactly what I want. You can think of this as kind of what my material is going to be like, my texture. So now the next thing that I need to do is find a way to output it. Now Houdini has tons of different ways of outputting things, just depending on what you want to do. I find that doing kind of, I guess it's like the old school way. I find that doing the old school way is actually technically the best for getting like flip books out and things like this that I'm going to use for materials. So what I do for that is I just go, instead of my object level here, I go to my out and I drop in a mantra. And the mantra just has, are you doing a frame range? Or are you doing just one frame, whatever? So I do frame range. It should fill in the start and end for you, but if not, you just type in what you have. You can go and select your camera. So if you just click here, there's camera 1. So that's what I did. You can just output it wherever. In the rendering, you can change like the pixel samples and stuff. I always do micro polygon rendering. That seems to be the best for me because it has quite a bit of options here that you can tweak. And then I always just render to disk, or I guess you can render it in the background so you can do other stuff, but just render it to the disk, and that should give you an output. Again, it usually just goes into your project. And then from there, I go to image, and I drop in an image network. So you just tab and type in image network, and that gives you an image network. And And if you double click on that, you can do some stuff. So what I do is I always bring in a file. So again, you can just tab type file. And then in that file, you just go and look for your pictures, basically. So I think it's somewhere in, yes, it's in my render here. So you can just grab your EXR, and that grabs everything. But I already have one here. If you kind of want to see what it's giving you, you can go to your composite view. It takes a little bit to catch up. So here you can see that it's already gridded out. So the way I do that is after I bring in the file, that EXR with all my frames, I always drop in what's called a mosaic. And that mosaic node, you can tell it, hey, I have 8 images per line for a total of 64. So that fills it in like this. So this is my entire flipbook, basically. And then you can always do a little pre-multiply. So if I highlight that, you can see maybe it's a little bit different, the difference there. So I think I tried both of these. I may have just gone with the regular mosaic one. But the way I always save this out is you can just right click on it and say save as an image. And then depending on if you're going to do, like if I tell it to save somewhere and I just call it, I don't know, example, .tga for Targa, I can say accept. And then I should get some options in here as far as like the size. So apparently this is like an 8K image. If I change that, I can say, do it by half and they'll give me a 4K image. That's a little bit better for, in-game use. If I have color in there, I can do color. If I have alpha, I can do alpha. But basically the color is an alpha. So I think we're fine on either of those, but you can always change that. And then click save. And that gets you this nice mosaic flipbook texture. All right, the next effect I wanted to do was kind of a falling sand effect. And I did this in a very similar way to the last effect in Houdini. Basically what I started with was I just put in a plane here. So I started with just a grid. And then once again, I went up to pyro effects. And instead of doing the billowy smoke this time, because I wanted something a lot thinner, a lot wispier, I did their wispy smoke preset. And again, that gave me the create density, and it outputted the thing to a pyro import again and an auto dop network. So again, anytime I'm working with kind of like a smoke or a fire effect in Houdini, I jump into that auto dop network and I look at the pyro. And on this one, yep, I did the same thing on that division size, and I kind of just shaped up the container box here. And then in here, the padding, I kept it fairly high actually on this one because it's fairly wispy. So I felt that this was fine. And then in that pyro solver, again, in the simulation, I sped it up just a little bit. And I wanted this thing to really disappear and cool down and dissipate fairly quickly. I didn't want this to always hang around and linger all the way down to the bottom of the box here. I really wanted it to kind of get really thin and wispy and kind of just disappear very quickly. So that's why these numbers are so low. The viscosity kind of gives it these like strands a little bit, as well as when we combine it with kind of the dissipation and the disturbance. The buoyancy lift, again, that just kind of really drags it down, and then the buoyancy direction, I just have a -10 in the y direction, so that's what's actually bringing it down. And the buoyancy lift is set really high to really drag it down. So I have a lot of downward motion on this. But yeah, so if I play this, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's just kind of falling like that. Then once again, I felt like, looping this was probably a good call. So again, I just dragged in that make loop, told it what frames. So I get this nice looping thing. Okay, and then really from here on out, it's basically the same. I did not put a distant light in here on this one because I didn't really want a whole lot of color variation. I wanted to handle all the color in Unreal this time, and I figured I just wanted basically like stark white, or just really just like one color. So this is all just like kind of a off white or kind of a lighter gray. So I just put my camera in, and from this one, instead of recording from the top, this one's a little bit more traditional. It's just recording from the side. So if I hit play, you can kind of see I'm only getting the tail end of it. So I'm getting this like falling, like imagine you're like inside a desert Egyptian tomb, and suddenly something moves and a little bit of sand falls from the ceiling, right? That's kind of the idea I wanted. So it's really thin, but I can always adjust that later. So once again, I go to my output and I drop in a mantra. This one I have the ROP texture sheets because I was just kind of messing around with that. But again, I always find it better to do the mantra, get my settings how I want, tell it where to render, tell it what camera to use, render it to the disk, and then go to my image network. And once again, I can come in here and we're showing that. So if I go to my composite view again, well, we're really zoomed out here. There we go. You can see, especially if I zoom in here, if we compare this to the scene view, number one, it is a bit hard to see. Let's see if I can get it. You can kind of see it's more blobby in the scene view. But when we show it in the composite view here, you can see it's more grainy, right? So that was what I wanted. This ended up looking pretty good for what I wanted. It looks more like sand particles falling. And then once again, I really wanted a mosaic. So again, I did 64 frames. And they're really thin. It's kind of hard to see once they're all mosaiced out. And then I just outputted that. And I could always make some tweaks and adjustments in Unreal on that end, but you can see what it's giving me here. And I'm just putting that on a texture sheet. Okay, so I'm in Unreal now. I have my images, my flipbooks that I rendered out of Houdini imported in, and I've already made some materials here. So here's my material instance that I'm using in the actual project itself. You can see the sand is kind of flowing down if I move the camera around, which is pretty cool. And then that billowy smoke effect that I recorded and rendered from the top down is what's making it kind of change and shift and kind of be like wispy and smoky and billowy like that, which looks pretty cool. And this is just the material instance, so it has just like a flow map and some values and stuff that I'm messing with. But if we jump over to the master material, you can see how it's actually set up. So it's just taking in a flow map, which is just a color map. For this one, I just wanted it to flow downward, so I just used red. You can kind of think of this as the direction that the normals are kind of like flowing or facing. Like if you make a flow map in Houdini, you can start with just a grid, and then you can actually visualize the normals and actually paint on the normals what direction you want them to flow. And as the direction of those normals is changing, so too does their color change. But again, in my case, I just wanted them to flow down, so I just used a solid red color. That was simple enough. And that's just grabbing, the RGB of it and kind of putting them all in here. And then we have this speed multiplier here. That's just a parameter. It's just kind of a color, white to black for the speed, which is then being multiplied by how much of the distortion you have. So one is like how fast it's flowing. The other one is, I guess, the actual movement of the flowing. So those kind of go together to create that flowing effect. And it's all being combined in with, I have a time for my input, and the time is just on the scale of 1. And that's all working through, combining with our speed and our distortion. And then what I have is just a texture coordinate and a tiling parameter. And all this is doing is it's coming together, and it's basically saying, okay, how much tiling do you want on these materials? Okay. And then it's basically just lerping between a couple different like samples of this material to kind of make it look like it's shifting. And if the lerp is taking in like our speed, let's see, it's taking in our speed and our distortion and our tiling, and we get kind of a good relationship between all those. When it lerps, it should kind of look like it's flowing a bit. So in here, this is just the default value, so it doesn't really look like it's flowing. The tiling is much too small, so you're not really seeing a lot of it. But then after all of that, you know, I have some comments in here for where everything should connect. But for here, I also have an opacity, so I had to set up an opacity. This is my texture that we got from Houdini. And all I've done on that is it's just in a folder called My Textures. And you can see here, it's actually quite bright. So all I did was turn up the brightness. So if I adjusted that down, you could see how it would change how the material looks. I don't know if I really want to do that right now because I am only on a laptop, and when it compiles the shaders, it takes quite a while. But basically, I just increased the brightness so that the color would be a bit more solid, but I can always adjust it back down so it's a bit more see-through and get some different effects. So it's pretty dynamic, it's pretty cool, and I can always adjust that either here or somewhere in the material or something. So I have that. It's pretty bright. That's what's making it less see-through, right? But then I have this flipbook set up, and it has a little input for a number of rows and columns. Well, I did 64 images in an 8x8 grid, so I'm just plugging in an 8 there. And then again, I'm using that same setup for the time. I probably could have just copied it down into here, but I just set up another time by the scale of 1. And if I adjust this, it can speed it up or slow it down. And then that's just plugging into the opacity. Then what I do is back in the material here, you can just right-click and say create a material instance, and that creates the instance. You can drag in your flow map so you can kind of see what it's doing here, flowing downwards. I have a different flow map here. I have kind of a radial one, so if I drag the radial one in, you can see now it's flowing in all kinds of different directions, doing some really crazy stuff. But again, for this one, I think I just wanted it to flow downwards, and that looks pretty cool. All right, so the next one I want to look at is this this falling sand material that I made. So again, this is taking that wispier sand that we recorded, just the bottom half of it, and you can see what it's doing in here. This one's a little bit simpler. It's a very similar approach to the flipbook setup on the last material. And really all I did was I just took that flipbook that I made in Houdini, imported it in here, brought it in as a texture sample, plugged in this flipbook into the UVs. It was the same thing. It was an 8x8 64 frame flipbook, so I just did 8 and plugged it into the rows and columns. And then here I did that same thing. I did a time. This time I got rid of the frac. I just did time multiplied by a number. This one I wanted it to just kind of flow a little bit slower, actually quite a bit slower, so I did 0.2. So you can kind of see what it's doing there. And then to get some color on there, really all I did was just multiplied it by a nice sandy color, put that into the base color, and then I also gave it a little bit of emissive. I toned it down quite a bit here with the multiply. That just makes it show up just a little bit more. Gives it some nice color variation as it kind of starts and spreads. And then the last thing I ended up adding was another little opacity here. So I am using this as the opacity, but it is being multiplied by a gradient. And that was just so as the thing fell, some of these pieces were just disappearing, and that main chunk down the middle was disappearing a little bit quicker. So it just kind of helped clean it up and kept it kind of nice. So if I maybe put it on a plane here, oh, now it has to compile again. Let's see. Hopefully that doesn't take too long. There, now you can see what it's doing. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now, I mean, I've been a little bit secretive, not wanting to show off what the viewport looks like here. And that's just because I also wanted to go over importing that mesh that Danny Diaz gave me. So we have the head. It's a skeletal mesh. And I believe when you bring everything in, there's kind of a little preview of what it might look like. When you bring it in, you got to make sure to get all the blend shapes and stuff that he gave me that you got to do import morph targets. And that'll bring everything in. That way it works really well. But anyways, I kind of have it in a scene here. You can see some of the falling sand here. That material on the face. It's pretty cool. So we'll just hit play on this really quick. Yeah, pretty cool. So as you can see, I have the falling sand in there. I have this flowing sandy face thing. I kind of have a similar flow map thing going on at the bottom here, just to give some more kind of sand emanating from the bottom here. And then if you notice, when the head shakes here, there's a little bit of sand flying off. So that's the next thing I'll break down. All right. So the way I accomplished that kind of sand effect falling off of the face when it kind of shakes back and forth in the middle there, I just made a material, and it's using this kind of cloudy texture that I made for another project, which is actually, you can see it in the game Maya of the Desert, my team's thesis project in the master's class here. But it's basically just a little cloudy poof that I have for some other sand and smoke effects in that game, in that project. And I just kind of recycled it here. I just wanted something that was a little cloudy, a little sandy looking. I'm giving it a nice, once again, just a nice sandy color. And I'm multiplying those together so that I get this color on there. And then I'm also just creating a noise, which I've changed the scale to something fairly small, so I get lots of little pieces like that. Those are multiplying together so that I get just this noisy graininess on this kind of like smoky, billowy, cloudy looking thing. And then I set up a dynamic parameter here, and I just called it opacity, and its default value is just 1. It's white. And I'm also multiplying that together, and that is its overall opacity. So that's that material. Then I create a particle effect here, and you can kind of see what it's doing in here. Can't really see the color too well in here, but that's okay. So in the required, all I've done is just dragged in my sand poof material. That's what I called it. For its lifetime, I wanted it to last, not too long, but not be too short either. So I settled on 0.85 min and max, just so it was nice and uniform. For its initial size, I just kind of dialed in a size. Once again, I didn't want it to be too random. I wanted it to all be fairly uniform, so I just did 25 all around. I kept it as a vector uniform. That way I could change it if I wanted to, but I just settled on 25 round figure. So its initial velocity, this is where I do have a little bit of changing in here. So I just have 10, 10, 10, and then sometimes it maybe doesn't move too much, but it expands a little bit more. So that's all fine. So that's giving me a little bit of variation in there, you can kind of see. It's color over life. I'm actually not doing anything in here because I'm handling the color here, but if I wanted to, I could handle the color in here, and maybe as it starts out, it's a little bit darker brown, and then towards the end of its life, it's a little bit lighter brown or tan. But I think its opacity is already going to kind of handle that a little bit. So you can handle the opacity in here, and I think I was actually experimenting with it, but then I just decided to set up a dynamic parameter for that. And so this is the dynamic right here. You just drop in a dynamic, let it refresh so it can actually read the opacity parameter that you've given that material. And then I've just set up 4 array elements so that it kind of starts out at 0, so you can't actually see it when it starts, and then pretty quickly it fills in, and then over its life it kind of fades away. So that's what's giving it that. And then its size, I have 2 elements here, and I'm starting it out pretty small and then ramping it up to 6 by the end of it. So it's just kind of giving me this, and that is what gives me, let's see, that is what kind of gives me, as it shakes its head here, you can see bits of sand flying off, and I don't know why it highlights random things, but there you go. That's kind of the idea there. So really all I'm doing is just spawning those particles. You can see I just have them all set up here. Kind of peeking behind the curtain, seeing the secrets of the magic here. But yeah, that's what's giving me that effect, and it looks pretty cool. It's game ready, it performs really well. I'm just on my little laptop here, and when I play it. Yeah, pretty neat.
Look what I got.